Welcome back to Catalyzing Coherence. We are here today broadcasting out of our Starfish Mission studio. We have set up everything for video and audio broadcast for the first time. So we're going to have a really awesome live video podcast here today. We are here with Jon Connors, the community director here at Starfish Mission.
Community development.
All right. Community. sorry. Community development
It's
here
okay.
at Starfish Mission. Welcome. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Matthew. Thank you, Brian. Really appreciate it. The only reason why I'm getting it's actually the funniest thing about the title thing. I negotiated coming in here a head of community development role, and every time, and I bought business cards, and now I have to cross it out. Not have to in a bad way, in a beautiful way. Because in a decentralized starfish organization, there is no head of community development. Yeah. It was a facade.
Not a directorship.
Not a directorship either. So yeah, it's just funny learning that as we're growing together.
One of the many things that we have to figure out as we create the whole new language around decentralization.
Definitely. Yeah, like the COO model, the CEO model. I've had a few friends in here for happy hours hanging out, crossing out their C's. You know what I mean? And just trying to play around with what does the new decentralized organization look like?
Yeah. Don't ask for permission, beg for forgiveness. Show up.
But there's nobody to beg to.
If there's exactly. So if there's value to add, this is what things need. If there's value to add, people just sometimes will step up and add that value, and you have done that here in enormous ways. And
thank you, Brian.
Glad to sort of be recording with you live. Here we are at Starfish Mission. I mean, we were just chatting, and Johnny and I, we all have amazing conversations on the reg, and Johnny started getting into the Hegelian dialectic in a way that allows us to explain the current situation that we find ourselves in, and the juices were flowing. We figured we might as well record something and see if we can share it with folks, because I think it's an important idea that very much explains where we are and what's happening in a way that, as Matthew and I like to say, is not just a metaphor. This is just this is what it is. So now what? So let's first explain what it is, and then maybe we can talk about what next. But you recently wrote an article for Medium, right? Can you give us the basic 101 of what you're talking about there?
Yeah, for sure. It was called Occupy Starfish, and it's a combination of, kind of a cultural exploration of the decentralized movement of Occupy Wall Street, combined with this decentralized co-working space of Starfish Mission. And the tying thread together is this decentralized, starfish organization that is Bitcoin, this cryptocurrency that was created by this unknown entity as a solution to the Wall Street collapse of 2008. Mm-hmm. So both Bitcoin and Occupy Wall Street had the same genesis block. Mm-hmm. And that genesis block was the destruction of the centralized financial status quo, the biblical Leviathan that we currently are dealing with every day in our daily lives. Yeah. And the fallout from that centralized narrative, we really haven't unpacked as a decentralized movement. Yeah. What actually happened in 2008 that led us to create a whole new currency? Mm-hmm. And can we look at it from that framing going backwards?
A lot of that seems to be, we didn't have at that time when we were feeling the most acute side effects of that financial collapse. We were feeling the side effects of, decisions made by centralized actors within these systems to use, within the financial system, to use algorithms that were very bad at analyzing the risk of all these mortgages that they were just packaging up so that somebody could get some, better CDO and get better returns. And there were very few people within the system who were making these decisions, and yet the impact on the community was immense. And then we realized that pain when everything came crashing down, but it was very opaque in terms of what happened.
Definitely.
And no one at that time was talking, this is over-centralization, really. It was too big to fail, maybe a similar language.
Which is exactly. Too big to fail is the information warfare mechanism they use to fill us with they had to do it. We had no other choice. Mm-hmm. But we didn't have the framing to say, hey, wait a minute. What the hell just happened? As you said, there's organizations like the SEC right now looking to regulate this decentralized solution to our problem that occurred. And no one's saying, hey, wait a minute, what happened last time in 2008 with the SEC? Mm-hmm. Did they actually stop securities fraud from occurring? And if they didn't then, what makes them the exemplars to regulate this industry moving forward? Or can we as a movement have our eye on that? Like, what actually went down?
Yeah, and that is the danger with all of this, is that we're developing, this nascent phase where we have all of this potential in the systems that we're building, in the decentralized systems, in the blockchain networks that we're building, with the potential to reevaluate how we really think about value and representing value. And we seem to be running the risk of just, reiterating the same patterns, falling back into the same old patterns, doing the same old stuff with this new technology.
No question. So in 1929, the centralized body, the SEC, was established after the collapse of the financial ecosystem in that time frame. Centralized finance collapses. It is inherently unstable. And decentralized finance would be the solution to our current problem. But instead, we turn to the SEC, a centralized body, and say, can you make centralized rules that will predict the next failure? Unfortunately, there are people who work at the SEC, make like $60,000 a year. It's not bad, great people. It's better than I make because I do passion project. But at the end of the day, they're regulating people who make $250,000 to $500,000 a year that have far higher resources, higher IQs, no offense, and therefore are way steps ahead of the curve. Yeah. So we're saying, please centralize, and then another piece of the centralized equation is that these guys are waiting to finish up their $60,000 a year bureaucrat job to get a job at this $200,000, $500,000 a year private or institution. And we say, thank you for regulating us. And thank you for making rules where only people who have $250,000 of investable capital can invest in the future. It's like, I don't know about that. I'd prefer, even though there will be some learning and some mistakes made along the way, I'd prefer to have the people's money. I'd prefer to not beg from a beggar's bowl of the centralized status quo on how to change this world. Mm-hmm. That seems to me like madness. Mm-hmm. It seems to be a little bit of insanity.
It seems quite insane, especially from the perspective that regulatory capture, right? There's this idea of, we need to have this regulatory body that understands all the rules and that has all the experience and that can therefore dictate from on high what the shape of this system should be. And yet, when they do that, even if they were to be effective, which there might be some argument for some level of efficacy, but there's also a massive amount of risk that comes from centralizing that power, right? As soon as you centralize that power, you paint a bullseye on their backs for anybody with enough money and enough desire to swing some opinions or apply pressure, right? Mm-hmm.
No question. So what we have, the issue with our entire social system right now is that even if we're getting our news from what used to be called decentralized sources like Facebook or Google or Twitter, let's be real, they're ultra centralized behemoths. We're either getting our news from New York Times, from Time Magazine, these media companies that are owned by 90% of the media companies are owned by 5 companies. Yep. That is centralization in its ugliest. And then now we're getting our news through the people, but through algorithms filtered by 5 large organizations like Amazon, like Google, like Facebook. So we're ultra filtered our perspectives. Mm-hmm. So the conversation that we started about the Hegelian dialectic is there's very few people sitting down telling us what's going on in the world from the true framing of centralization versus decentralization. Yeah. And centralized structures inherently have enormous faults and failures. And the biblical story of the Tower of Babel is one example of when things get too big to fail, they will come crashing down to earth. Yeah. It's a historical pattern that will replicate itself.
Yeah. It's archetypal, and we talk about archetypes on this show. They're important frameworks for us to understand the world, and so the patterns, the deeper we can go into sort of the treasure trove of existing archetypes of patterns that we have. Jordan Peterson talks about theories as tools, right? So these are ways that we can actually understand the world, like the Tower of Babel collapsing. What does that seem like? Like if we were to really break
too big to fail,
too big to function.
1929 finance, yeah, exactly. 1999 finance, or maybe it was the savings and loan crisis. I forget exactly when that was.
Right.
There are these consistent patterns happening all the time, and then our centralized news sources never come out and say we need a new currency.
Right.
What happened was Satoshi Nakamoto, that unknown entity, just created emergently this new solution.
Well, that speaks a lot about the fact that we tend to focus on symptoms as opposed to root causes, right? Mm-hmm, the root cause of over-centralization is going to manifest itself in numerous symptoms,
Yes.
all of which can be presented independently and all of which could be, in theory, propagandized in a way, right?
No question.
And so we get caught up at this very surface level of analysis, and especially in a media landscape before the internet or before YouTube was a primary mode of disseminating information. And even now, it's over-centralized because it's in Google's hands.
Oh, no question on that one.
But before that, we had this mode of not only were we only addressing the symptoms, but even the symptoms were only being discussed and pushed out to the public through a handful of media outlets.
Okay.
So what are the roots here, right? So we can talk about the symptoms, but I think folks have a general sense of the symptoms, right? Things are not working that well.
Yeah.
What are the root causes? What do we know is actually happening? And so we're going to get to the Hegelian dialectic, but I would just take it even one step further in my own thinking, which is that the Hegelian dialectic has a framework, a root in Taoism. This is a dance. This is a primal dance that happens.
Wow.
The yin and the yang. There's tension. Bucky Fuller would talk about tension as a Dymaxian evolution. This is a necessary process to creating more, to creating better. This is truly to our benefit. That's the thing that people need to start realizing, is that this chaotic world, these challenges we face, are actually our greatest opportunities.
Oh, I love that.
And we can rise to the occasion like never before. So let's get into this Hegelian dialectic. Where are we? What's going on?
First, can I send a little context?
Sure, yeah.
So the Hegelian dialectic, when I first learned about it, was through the lens of Marxism.
Right.
And Marx came out and, a lot of...
Let's just preface that. All of Marx's framework comes from Hegel.
Yeah.
He was a student of Hegel.
Deeply. And it comes down from this idea that there's a huge polarity. There's the thesis statement, which Marx's thesis was that industrial capitalism. And then his antithesis to industrial capitalism was his form of communism, socialism, whatever you want to call it. I look at it as a somewhat centralized equation. He sees the means of production. So in my perspective, looking at Marx, he's saying centralized oligarchical capitalism, which is either America or China or what's going on globally today, needs to be countered with centralized oligarchical communism, or in some way. Maybe he didn't specifically say that, but his students have implemented that globally. So the synthesis, which is supposed to happen at the arrival of of these two Dymaxian,
the tensions, the thesis and the antithesis,
create this synthesis. And the synthesis that was created was a global oligarchical world. So two centralized thesis and antithesis have not led to a better world, world order for the rest of us.
Yeah.
So the maximum capability for the Hegelian dialectic in the world today, in my opinion, is to go, instead of two centralized organizations, two centralized philosophies, to go from globalized, centralized Leviathan that is the political, social, economic thing that is just getting Tower of Babel style, to the self-sovereign, decentralized humankind.
Right.
What this cell is in the superconscious human organism.
Right. And so that's where nature comes into play, right? So we can start to think about how do natural systems find harmony in their environment. And so as we design these new systems, we can look to the decentralization of nature, which tends to be non-local at times, in terms of like thinking about a mycelial forest underneath the woods, the trees. They actually distribute resources to each other on a as needed basis.
No question.
Well, I mean, it's definitely more complex than that, but it's I want to go back to the thread of
What do you mean it's more complex than that?
It's not necessarily on an as needed basis in terms of the mycelial networks. It's interesting because there's a lot of information signaling. It's actually much more like a negotiation process. It's a market process in many ways between the tree root systems, the network systems underneath the forest, and the mycelial systems that are able to bring up more,
harvest nutrients and share.
Harvest smaller nutrients that the root systems can't necessarily get. So in exchange that for sugars from the trees, and the trees can use photosynthesis to actually basically drive that process.
It's a closed loop.
And they have effectively economic negotiations, right, between all those networks. And so there are, like, so what you're saying, I think what you're saying is, like, there are points where there are needs for particular types of resources, and that kicks off a negotiation process.
Yeah.
And then it can flow through that network.
It flows. Flow is a very important concept people need to familiarize themselves with. Nature flows. Water, it flows.
Everything flows. Information flows.
The economy it flows. You know where it flows? It flows at the tip where those super rich bankers have these super fast computers that are just taking all the money from
Vampire.
Or as Rolling Stone called the giant squid of Goldman Sachs.
Where does it not flow? Through the people.
Yeah. The 2 billion starving human beings on this planet.
Through the actual exchange of needs. What do people need? They need love. They need food. They need shelter. They need community.
So many people in the streets right outside of us that need shelter. In the richest city in the country. No question on that one.
Well, I mean, that's a whole nother can of worms to open up here.
We open cans of worms here.
I think maybe a unifying thread that could tie those two ideas together is this notion that there's a large, maybe even all three threads going back to Marx. There's a massive disconnect oftentimes between ideological rhetoric and the actual operation of the systems on the ground.
Well said.
And so the systems on the ground, the reality of physical being actually operates at the level of the individual, right? It's individual homeless people on the street.
Yes.
And it's individual people stepping over them.
Yes.
Again,
myself
and again,
included.
and again and again.
Yes, sir.
And some of us, some of us feel more shame about it than others, and some of us have more of an emotional response
Matthew,
than
have
others.
I told you I've adopted a homeless person named Thomas?
Thomas.
I haven't told you about this.
No.
You haven't.
Nick's met Thomas. So there's a guy I live right now, at least down the street at Soma. There's a homeless guy named Thomas that he's always begging for money outside the market.
Sure.
And I've sort of developed somewhat of a relationship with him over time. So I'm always passing him. I bought him food a bunch of times.
Sure.
Last time we hung out, I bought him, we went into the market, I was like, what do you want? He's like, I want pizza. He orders 4 massive slices of deep dish pizza and a whole sort of thing of orange juice. And I'm like, we're gonna really talk about some stuff. I'm gonna get you all these things. And so we had a conversation, like really trying to understand the root causes of like, why are you out on the streets every night begging for food? The guy is apparently hearing voices. He's
schizophrenic, has no way to no alleviation of that particular psychological issue with our current healthcare.
No one's helping him other than so he's gone to a priest and he's trying to work himself into a job there.
Yeah.
He and I are meeting in 2 weeks to see if he told me he's going to go every day for 49 days. So
to tie that back just for one moment to decentralization in its finest, on my left arm is a Christian anarchist tattoo, and that would be the individual at its finest, serving the network, giving to the poor, giving to the sick, is the best way to create a cogent, decentralized society. It's a little out there, but...
Yeah, no, it definitely is. I mean, and I would like to maybe just go back to where we were before we started talking about Thomas, and like the kind of... So the idea of the fact that there's this dissociation between the language and the rhetoric that we talk about in terms of decentralization or Marxism or any of these ideological...
Or Republican versus Democrat.
Yeah.
Duverger's law.
And any of these things, right? There's an inherent separation between the word structure and the actual behaviors that we actually have to act out to embody the reality of our words, of what we claim to represent. And I think it's interesting to map that onto these financial systems, especially, or the decentralization versus centralization,
political systems.
Centralization tension, and this question that I think you're right in the middle of here, and we're broadcasting from also the epicenter of, is this question of how do we act out the decentralized behaviors at the organizational level, at the personal level, with our company that we're trying to build, and how do we understand the flows of value from a particularly decentralized perspective? How do we navigate and operate and choose goals? How do we do that?
What does this synthesis take into consideration?
Yeah. Well, first I'm going to just pull back a little bit because we're nailing on even what got us so excited to sit down and pull out the mics and talk right now was this political alignment around a new Hegelian dialectic between the centralized and centralization and decentralization. And to go back to your point about narratives that aren't really aligned with that, Reagan-era Republicans made the claim of decentralization, of the empowered individual.
Well, the decentralized marketplace, right?
They decentralized marketplaces, but they centralized resources to the Pentagon.
Yeah.
Enormously.
Like anti-market.
No question whatsoever. So they had a rhetoric of decentralization, but an action of pure and utter centralization. Same thing with George W. Bush. So we have a Republican-Democrat story, a political science narrative of decentralization as an underlying thread, but the actions don't actually line up with it. the true decentralized political movement in the United States would need to dismantle centralized systems that are not in benefit of all of humankind. Mm-hmm. And the Pentagon would have to be one of those things that are hyper defunded because of the amount of resources that centralized behemoth is taking up.
I was talking to a buddy who has some military background, who apparently the military, you know what, we won't share that part. But yeah, I mean, generally speaking,
you can have some assassins on the roof here.
Seriously, I don't even
blessings to them as well.
And honestly, like you don't have to want to believe everything you hear, but generally speaking, this point that we are spending money on the wrong things is so ludicrous. It's so outrageous. The things that we spend money on and don't spend money on.
Yeah, so an oligarchical capitalist model allows Raytheon to make money bombing Syria and Halliburton to make money repaving the roads in Syria. Yet a decentralized radical capitalist might look at that and say, that's a bullshit marketplace. I would love to see Raytheon's stock price.
It's a failed marketplace.
Yeah,
right? Because the market participant, the people who are being bombed are market participants in theory.
By no choice of their own.
Yet they have no voice in the system there. Right?
No question.
So that's a failure of that market because it's centralized actors from some other place in the globe. And this kind of ties into this idea of like, so defunding the Pentagon, right? What are the implications of that? It kind of ties into this idea that you have to solve this globally, and that's one of the wonderful parts about the crypto revolution or this decentralized revolution is it's natively global, it's natively transnational, so that you actually can build up this system for people to represent their will, their wishes, their value outside the domain of the centralized state and have a chance of solving it in many places at once, so that, for example, you don't necessarily defund the Pentagon and then get invaded. By another centralized country or something.
This is where I align with the more libertarian decentralized crew of being prepared in case such an issue were to come down.
Yeah.
But, we don't have to go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be messy.
Yeah.
It does not have to be messy. We're all doing this together. Like, we want the benefit of everyone, of everything on this planet. So it does not have to be messy.
So my argument as a decentralist, if you will, if that's now a new thing, the decentralist would be prepared to grow their own food, take care of their own water, take care of their own energy at the cellular familial level, as well as defend themselves and their family and their family's resources.
Well, and
that's just my perspective on it. It doesn't have to be everybody's.
But also doing that through the means of community as well.
Definitively. If each node in the community had that, Israel 1948, for instance, was a great example of this. They had a decentralized strategy for protecting their land in a time when not very many people were friendly around them. And how they did it was every single person knew how to grow their own food in a harsh climate. And every single man at that time was trained with firearms. And they were able to stabilize their nation state in a very destabilized time.
So I don't agree with guns.
Sure.
I actually do not think this has to include like violence at all. But
protection is different than... But
sure. And like, you know what? My buddy knows jujitsu, or like I've got a guy who's a black belt in karate, whatever. I mean, that's a symptom, right? We were talking about symptoms. The violence is a symptom of a system that's broken. What are people violent about? They're violent about their needs not being met in some capacity.
Yeah. No question. It's generally conflict over a resource that is in theory zero sum in that moment or that place in time.
It's an important point.
And so there's competition and there's conflict. It's like, oh, you want that glass of water? I also want that glass of water. No amount of negotiation is able to solve it. No amount of community norms is able to solve it. And if there's a breakdown at all those levels, then it's just you and me and force.
So exactly. I mean, I guess a case study example of a successful nonviolent approach would be Gandhi. But if we take Gandhi to the current centralized status quo, there are actors that acted very similar to Gandhi that were treated much different. And that were people in Guantanamo Bay who were not given the right to a fair trial, who were in prison for over 10 years, who said, I'm going to stop eating like Gandhi said, I'm going to stop eating. And the British Army allowed Gandhi to stop eating because he has human rights. The U.S. officials in these black operations sites fed these people up the rectum. It's not a joke. I'm not making this up. It's completely open. So this centralized status quo has implemented a particular strategy towards nonviolent actors. I'd prefer to at least have peace through strength, though I can sit at the table with another brother and sister and with who choose not to take a peace through strength stance. I just study what's going on too much to not be prepared.
And that's where the beauty of community comes into play.
Yeah.
this is a symphony, as I like to say, and we all play different instruments.
Yeah. So I mean, that does tie into this idea of coherence, right? In the sense that we have different perspectives on an issue like this,
right.
That largely probably come from our different paths through life, our different experiences, the communities that we've seen or been in. Like, you both, obviously, you're sitting here, you're different people, you're dressed differerly, you have different rhetoric, you
and
have
we're
different
still
ways
friends.
of thinking.
What do you know?
Yeah.
What do you know?
We share mysticism in common.
Different perspectives on like, the use of force, but
Archangel Michael's my homie, by the way.
But there are ways that we can still get along. There are ways that we can still communicate effectively. I think that's one of the things we've had this high level breakdown of our rhetoric. We've had this high level focus on how we're different, and the fact that, like, if we disagree on something like a gun or its use, that we can't even be in the same community anymore.
Yeah, no question.
At any scale, and that's an open question, and it's an interesting question to talk about, I think.
No question on that one. Yeah, to switch away from the gun conversation, because that can be its own haywire, I'll go back to even the genesis moment for me at Occupy Wall Street, if that's okay. I was a business school graduate.
Go back to decentralization.
Yeah. Business school graduate, watched Wall Street collapse in 2008, and wrote about it in the Medium article, and was just like, this thing is not functioning, and no one's really having the conversation about this thing not functioning. And now I can actually see in financial models exactly where the BS assumptions of perpetual economic growth exist. A lot of companies are overvalued and untruly valued in the eyes of finite resources on planet Earth. So it was kind of weirded out by it, but didn't know what to do. Needed to make money to feed my wine and women habit and just continue on my lifestyle of not enlightenment, And all of a sudden, a bunch of these hippies in the park hanging out, and I took LSD. I took LSD, and though I was dressed
was that
like
the first time?
First time in since I was 15.
Johnny, you took a trip?
I took a trip at age of 30. You know what I mean? And I was like, all of a sudden, these I considered myself Jedi, and some of the people Ewok-y. With love.
May the Force be with you.
Indeed, brother. And I've melted my mind of the difference of the separation between me and these individuals, and I started to study about decentralized economies and the value that comes from them and the emergent properties that arise from them, and started hanging out at the anarchist table in my suit, talking to bankers as they walk by about the value of a decentralized economy. That if we could eliminate these large squid actors like Goldman Sachs that they're slaving away for anyways, why wouldn't they get a good chunk of value for their work, just not have to give it to the dead squid on the way to work? You know what I'm saying?
And just for the record, we're not blaming this on any particular banker. In fact, I know some bankers. They're my friends. They're my family, in fact.
Bankers are people too.
Bankers are people too.
Definitely people.
But they
I just look to disrupt their business model. It doesn't mean I hate those people.
They don't
It's
know
the free market.
They don't know better yet.
It's not quite yet because of the SEC. But
and let's just appreciate that to consider that there's an inertia that they're a part of that they don't even quite realize, and it's about stepping out of the stream to see what's actually happening.
Feed the centralized behemoth so that you can get yours.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, those of us who have been in the game long enough now realize that the centralized behemoth is not returning value to the majority of people, the majority of shareholders. Even.
Actually, I just want to, for the record, my brother does not work at Goldman Sachs anymore. So I don't have family. I do have family, but they've chosen other paths.
We're all a family here.
We're all family here.
I think that's also an interesting thread to take it back to some of the dialectical elements of Marxism as well, in the sense that there's this structural element that he was observing, but I don't think he really he kind of perhaps framed his analysis incorrectly in the sense that
sees the means of production,
which is basically like saying, sees the centralized node, not necessarily realizing that the fact that you have a particular as long as you have the capital coming into one point and then flowing out to the people who have actually created in the chain of value, the laborers who have created it, as well as the people who have done the intellectual labor and the investment in it. But if the capital is flowing back through the system only through that one point, it gives every tier above the workers the ability to profit take or to rent seek, right? So it creates this huge asymmetry in the way that the value flows back into the system. And he kind of, I think he may have missed the mark in terms of his analysis, but
he saw the future pretty well. Forgive him for not understanding technological advances to include into his economic theories.
I mean, he certainly noticed the fact that there was an asymmetry here, and that people were not necessarily getting value that that was symmetric with what they've put in.
Definitely.
Right?
The Irish who built the railroads at the time that he was writing were living in shanties and treated very, very poorly.
But then the failure was also a centralized failure, because even if you implemented Marxism in a centralized political system, what you were doing was creating
Mao Zedong, massacre.
You're trying to create a
Joseph Stalin. No, thank you for the people. What? Except for those 10 million.
Right.
Whoops.
Yeah.
It's like death. Death
why?
in mass.
And why? Because they're creating one big centralized people computer.
And then fit into this mold.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then the fact is, reality is complex, immensely complex, way too complex for a single centralized people computer. Now, the terrifying part is actually now China has no longer a people computer. They have, some of the world's best
greatest mind control on the planet,
creating technologically enabled centralization, and they're putting all of their effort behind systems, and they're even using decentralized systems to empower their centralization.
No question.
So, are you familiar with the citizen score?
No. Oh yeah, that's preventing people from flying.
Effectively, their credit score, tying the idea of a credit score to political compliance.
Maybe you've seen the episode on Black Mirror. It's pretty similar.
Got it. No, I haven't seen that. But
yeah. Well, that one also includes like social ranking, but this one's also like the values in society are effectively dictated by the Politburo.
Yeah.
And then your compliance is monitored throughout the entire.
So the centralized system is being fed by decentralized inputs.
So let's say that you make a Weibo post, which is kind of like their Facebook/Twitter.
Got it.
And you say something critical of the new, essentially dictatorship, right? You could wake up the next day no longer being able to buy a bus ticket or your food, and your credit cards don't work. None of that works, right? Because it's all connected by technology.
So no longer the gulag; it's now instead just starvation.
Now the reach of the centralized authority is truly fractal in a digital sense.
Yeah. Let's make a point of this. This is actually happening. This is the world we live in.
Deeply. Yeah, and I'm not laughing in a funny way. I'm laughing in that twisted way.
It's tragic.
Yes, sir.
It's tragic.
It is tragic.
And
it's empowered by technology.
It's empowered by technology that we're a part of. It's a reflection of us. But we also live in a free world where this is not the world we live in yet.
Got it.
And even our brothers and sisters in China, God bless them.
Bless them.
That their future's a little brighter than this sort of dictation of a decentralized AI system that however they're trying to use that for their governance. But here we are, like 3 actual activist change makers, people doing stuff.
Yeah.
There's people all around us, even in Starfish here, and in San Francisco, around the world, that they're doing things too, and we know that this is not the future we want to have, right?
No question. And even when I took a little jab at the banking system, I don't want to eliminate them. I want to outperform the hell out of them in the marketplace.
We're going to
you know what I mean?
We want to automate them.
Yeah, straight up. There you go. Where's your bye?
You didn't like
CEO as well.
You didn't like working that job at your banking job. Oh, you don't have to do it. Like no one does. We can build something that does it in a way that's more fair, more fluid for everything to flow.
To go back for a moment, I was mentioning the archetype of the CEO. Here we are in Silicon Valley, which is really capitalizes so well on ecosystems and the idea of networks. Mm-hmm. But yet we still have the cult of the CEO here that is like a sickness in our culture.
Yeah,
I love the smart contract DAO idea of literally eliminating the CEO.
Yeah,
it's like stop praying to that god and let's instead have an empowered populace, an empowered network outperform the hell out of those inefficient CEO model companies.
So that's the interesting thing. Like I was at a conference about a year ago that was like re-envisioning democracy, basically a conference down in Palo Alto.
Got it.
And I was having a conversation with somebody about why do we still have these CEOs? Like what are the advantages of having
charisma,
that
the
much
ability
power,
to raise capital from centralized players?
Well, so
you have Sand Hill Road contact.
There's that externalized perspective. I guess our conversation was shifting a little bit more towards the idea of inside the company itself in terms of decision making. And there was this interesting idea of, so far as we've developed technology thus far, and this is what we're trying to change in the decentralized model, and some of what we're doing with Oro, which is a side project of ours, name drop.
Yeah, name drop. Ooh, plug that all day.
But there's still this problem of how do you effectively and very quickly collapse a lot of collective intelligence into directed decision making. And so up until this point, it's been put in the hands of single individuals because there's a way of like instantly kind of having that like wave function collapse through one mind.
Got it.
Which is extremely inefficient and can be very dangerous for the system.
But it's also efficient in the fact that it's not analysis by paralysis.
Exactly.
Things get done.
Yeah.
You know, my mentor is a 5-time CEO, African-American guy from Newark, New Jersey named Ralph Garvin. A brilliant computer scientist, 170 IQ. The guy's freaking brilliant.
Oh, wow.
But we kind of have a Jedi battle, lightsabers on the table, is this, I spent it
Just a Jedi mind battle.
Oh, definitely. 2 years in his organization, learning a ton, sopping up the knowledge. But there are instances with which centralized proclivities and centralized niceties do not lead to effective collective action. And I'd rather, I can't wait to invite Ralph in to help program out a lot of CEO positions, especially in the enterprise space, because that's where a lot of his mind share is. But the idea is that, like, if we create Knights at the Round Table governance style, where we can call each other out on each other's shit, because sometimes we're off and our perspectives have a blind spot. Yeah. If we have this pointed measure where we have to yield to it just out of social nicety, we lose business effectiveness. We lose the ability to create shareholder value.
Tolstoy wrote about this as well. Some of you may know Leo Tolstoy.
Oh, indeed.
Well, you don't have to read War and Peace, though. I might recommend you do. It's a great book. But it is his view of history, how it operates, and he's basically bashing the sort of theory of the hero, and that there is no one person. It's not Napoleon that's like making all these things happen.
Definitely.
It is this decentralized mess
under him
of emergent synthesis.
Yeah.
Whoa.
The interesting thing to tie into that is that there's this anti-hero narrative element of that narrative. That being said, there's a lot of power to stories like the hero's journey, like Campbell's hero's journey, and the way you might be able to tie them together while still being able to have your cake and eat it too, is the fact that in a network, in a graph, every node can be looked at as the center
as their
hero.
Yeah.
So without a CEO, without forming this permanent structure, you can have everyone living their hero's journey and coordinating in a way without any like one singular hero, or like the big man hypothesis, right?
We are as gods and might as well get good at it. Let's start with being heroes.
So I just want to go back for a minute, because there are CEOs in our company, in our office. I don't have a problem with all CEOs, nor do I think all CEO companies are a problem. I really do support companies that are functioning under that hierarchical mechanism. I'm just challenging the rhetoric of the cult of the CEO, deeply embedded in the DNA of Silicon Valley.
That shit away.
You're the gadfly. So decentralizing gadfly.
Yeah,
the person changing the models, creating the chaos.
Yes, sir.
And it's not necessarily because we hate people or we like have animosity towards people. No. It's because we're trying to take the structures that exist and blow them apart a little bit and say, hey, we can put them back together in a better way.
Yeah, this isn't anti anything.
Thank you.
This is pro all of us.
Yeah, rock on with that. And pro the value of the network versus the rigidity and structure of the formalized 20th century hierarchy.
Yeah.
Precisely.
And I think the best way to go about, an effective way in my mind of going about this is like, if you can find value wherever it lies, and you can represent that in the systems that's used to actually do the transaction of value and represent what we create together, and then represent where the rewards should go when something works, then we can actually start having a much more granular grip on reality in a way that we don't have to focus so much on in-group, out-group, or like we don't have to like have scapegoats for this, because so many scapegoats. It's like, why'd things go wrong? We don't know why things went wrong.
9/11, we had scapegoats.
The world's complex. It's complex reality. It's like there's a million reasons why it may have gone wrong. And so you blame it on the scapegoat.
9/11 scapegoat was Afghanistan, though 20 of the 22 bombers were Saudi Arabian. So the scapegoat thing can get pretty nasty real quick.
Yeah. And the thing is, the scapegoat, if you fall prey to the scapegoat, then the person who gets to define it is usually the person with the largest megaphone.
Oh, indeed.
If this isn't you or me or any of us, then who's going to do it?
Yeah.
All of us. This is our job.
Our collective hero's journey.
It's our collective hero's journey.
Yes, sir. Fully aligned with that one. Go back quickly to Leo Tolstoy.
Yeah.
He wrote a book in 1890-ish called The Kingdom of God is Within You. Mm-hmm. And it's the core doctrine for anybody who believes in Christian anarchism. So he's the first decentralized JC follower.
That sounds like an interesting Wikipedia read.
Yeah, definitely.
Check that book out too.
Indeed.
Cool. So I think we're actually coming up on the time for the day. Is there anything that we want to wrap up on? Any notes that we want to get out there before we wrap this first session here?
Yeah, another piece that's just a quick, maybe 9-page read is Friedrich Hayek's The Use of Knowledge in Society.
Yeah.
Talks very clearly about the benefits of decentralized economic distribution, and it's the core premise behind a lot of, I think, the economics of token distribution that's going on in the space today.
So perhaps we could get together for another episode, talk a little Hayekian and Austrian school economics. That could be fun.
Badass. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for all that you bring to the office of Starfish Mission and just the excitement, the culture, the unique perspectives. You guys are a huge asset to the organization.
We love being here with you too, Jon.
Namaste, friends.
Indeed.
Thank you, everybody.
Blessings.
Take it easy.